Good evening. And tonight we discuss the question of when did farming begin? When did these agricultural institutions take hold? Because what we know today is that they are necessary for advanced societies. When you have thousands or millions of people that are doing tasks not related to their daily life, they need to be supplied with food. If you have other higher endeavors, like intellectual endeavors, you need time to think and write and endeavor. And that requires others to be farming for your benefit. Now, up until about 30 years ago, we believe that agriculture began around 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. But many people today are up to speed, and they believe that agriculture has no single simple origin. That a wide variety of plants and animals have been independently domesticated at different times and in different places. And according to them, the first agriculture appears to have developed at the closing of the Pleistocene, or the end of the last ice age, which we refer to as the Younger Dryas event, around 11,700 years ago. At this time, temperatures warmed, glaciers melted, sea levels rose, and ecosystems throughout the world reorganized. Now, any sane person, after they read that statement, would realize the real lies. That what happened at the closing of the last Pleistocene, or Ice Age, about 11,700 years ago, was the rebirth of agriculture. Because prior to that, the climate was just too extreme to grow anything. And hunters and gatherers were prevalent for about 2,000 to 3,000 years. Because no domestication of animals were possible, based on the facts of what was occurring. From 15,900 to 11,700, the temperature rose and dropped 3 times, up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That would mean that any domesticated crops would be impossible. Now, the fact that the mainstream didn't pick up on this is, well, dubious at much. And the reason I say that is because the control mechanism is in place. Because they don't want you to know the real facts, that domestication and agricultural institutions have existed for tens of thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years. They want you to think that this is all a recent development. And that's just to control you. Now, the history of agriculture records the domestication of plants and animals and the development and dissemination of techniques for raising them productively. And agriculture began independently in different parts of the globe at different times. And clearly we know this to be true because different crops were being raised in different regions for different purposes, independent of any global let's say, ancient travel by ancient peoples. They still grew what grew well in their regions that they knew how to grow. And that's because that led to prosperity. Now, wild grains were collected and eaten from at least 105,000 years ago. We know this due to archaeological sites that we've recovered data. However, the domestication did not occur until around 9,500 BC. And we think that's BS. Because all of the data prior to the Younger Dryas event 11,700 years ago has been erased due to a cosmic catastrophe that basically took an eraser to the surface of the planet. And tonight we're going to discuss some of the details. Now, as of 11,000 years ago, domestication of grains and crops were occurring in these regions. Now, if you notice, all of the regions are south of the glacial extent of the last ice age, the Wisconsinian, where the North Pole is posited to be somewhere here on Greenland. And then a crustal slip took that pole up here into Canada just 12,000 years ago. Now, these isolated regions end at a certain point here on this line for good reason, because nothing could grow above there. And during the Younger Dryas event, even these regions became unstable. But what you're looking at is the regions around 9,000 years ago that were being cultivated. And there's clay evidence. This is a 6,000-year-old find from an archaeological site showing oxen pulling a plow. Now, clearly, if you just look at this effigy and these carvings, this model that was created 6,000 years ago or more, this is not something that they just invented. This is something that had been going on for eons, in my opinion. And then we come over to chart factories like the Scientific American here, where they purport that the first farmers arrived in Europe just 6,000 years ago and inequality evolved. This is the narrative that the globalists want you to believe, that there is division between cults, and that 7,000 years ago, some people knew how to farm and others didn't. But it's my opinion that this is a false narrative. Now, if you come over to the Americas, Native Americans flourished in the Americas for over 30,000 years. We're going back to the Solutrean up into the present, when just recently, just 600 years ago, these populations ended. And that was due to the introduction of disease from the, from the modern world. Smallpox blankets much? Now, that's an easy way to describe what happened over the last several centuries. But the reality is that around 1000 AD, or 1,000 years ago, there were many Europeans mingling with the natives and trying to steal their land. And the land steal was complete by 1350 AD. Because of drought and other compromising conditions, the controlling mechanisms in North America caused the Mayans to be flushed away south, to lose control of the native Pueblo people, and the megalithic cultures to the east had already succumbed to the influence of the Vikings and other Easterners moving into the region. Now, the Scandinavians and the Europeans that moved in here and actually decimated the societies began moving in probably 800 AD. Yes, 1,300 years ago. And the disease had wiped out hundreds of millions of people within 500 years. It's anyone's guess what these cultures could have taught us about life today and how to live in harmony with nature, but that is being crushed by the mainstream narrative because they don't want you to realize that we can live in harmony with Earth without polluting, without creating any waste, surviving and thriving in the future. But Algerian glyphs show otherwise, that right after the Younger Dryas event, these agricultural techniques were known by millions of Africans. And here an African glyph shows just that. Milk cows, cattle, and other farming techniques shown clearly in a glyph, in a cave. Now, how the first farmers changed history? Well, it's not a mystery. Beneath the rocky slope in central Jordan lie the remains of a 10,000-year-old village called Ain Ghazal, whose inhabitants lived in the stone houses with timber roof beams 10,000 years ago. The walls and floors gleamed with white plaster. clearly not a hunter and gatherer society. Hundreds of people living there worshipped in a circular shrine and made haunting, wide-eyed sculptures that stood 3 feet high. They buried their cherished dead under the floors of their houses, decapitating the bodies in order to decorate the skulls. But as fascinating as this culture was, something else about the Ghazal intrigues archaeologists more. It was one of the first farming villages to have emerged after not the dawn of agriculture, but the end of humanity. So herein lies the problem. The dogmatic statements by the mainstream versus the more scientific analysis of the critical thinkers. The dawn of agriculture was simply the dawn of re-agriculture after a major cosmic catastrophe. Agriculture had existed for maybe 100,000 years prior to the Younger Dryas event, but the Ghazal, well, they rose to the challenge. In just a few hundred years, we're back in full domestication, raising barley, wheat, chickpeas, and lentils, as well as animals. So there is something clearly missing from the scientific record. In fact, the first evidence of farming in the Mideast 23,000 years ago, evidence of the earliest small-scale agricultural cultivation, which is not true, but it's the furthest back we can get it so far. That paper came out in 2015, and no one in the mainstream talks about it. This is a sign of the times, where disinformation is key, the manipulation of the narrative is the purpose of your existence, and the sheep that surround you are the problem. We need to wake people up to the facts that are being hidden from them, and the fact that they need to know how to grow their own food. See, this is a trick of those that are in control. Once they can teach you how to unlearn how to live for yourself, well, that's the very moment you should become very scared. And that moment is now. 98% of the population has no idea how to source their own food unless it comes from a store. What if tomorrow all the stores don't exist? What would you do? Well, I would call that the rebirth of agriculture, in my opinion. And that's a boom to your ignorance and our knowledge. Collectively, we ask you one question. If you do not know how to survive without the use of a store, when the power goes out, how will you live? How will you grow food? How will you wild harvest? How will you hunt? How will you do it? How will you get through it? We love each and every one of you. Thanks to all the Patreons that stepped up. Every day we get a new Patreon in the club, and we love each and every one of you. I hope you're listening to this message. It's a scientific-backed statement of integrity and the fact that you've been lied to your entire life. And only recently, with the advent of the internet, can we disseminate this information to the masses. This is not conjecture. These are facts based on scientific endeavor, the likes of which many people will never know. Most civilians think food comes from a store. Children born in the last 30 years have no idea how to provide for themselves without buying something at Walmart. These are the problems that exist as we enter the new paradigm, which is not the new normal. The normal should be that every sentient living being on earth knows how to love and nurture each and every one of their family members and their neighbors. They know how to collectively help each other, bring themselves up and survive and thrive in the future. but that's just not how it's working today. We are all slaves on a slave planet with a slave model with elite oligarchic controllers. And until we rise up and tear those barriers down, nothing will change. Ever. Until the sun gives off its glorious flare and the Stone Age is upon us. And that time is coming soon. Proper prior planning prevents piss-poor performance in a future that you may be unaware of. Be safe. We love you. That's a boom.